I'm very pleased to be able to speak with Dr. William Fung, the Executive Director of Li & Fung, global supply chain logistics behemoth in a sense, 15,000 suppliers in 40 economies. You're probably the best person to be able to give us a sense of how the supply chain world is evolving in the context of so many of the changes being put on us in the global economy today. On the one hand, the regulators are coming in, and there is a greater push in terms of domesticating the marketplace, especially in the US and in some developed marketplaces. On the other hand, there is the inevitability of the impact of the internet and trade flows globally. To try and sort of contextualize what we need to deal with today, maybe you can start by giving us a sense of your take of that conversation between President Obama and Steve Jobs when last year when he was still alive, where Steve Jobs turned around to President Obama and said, and President Obama's question was, can we bring the manufacturing jobs back to the US? And Steve Jobs' answer was that, the flat answer was no. And that was because manufacturing as a global complexity had changed so much. When you read that episode, what occurred in your mind, and what did you concur with Steve Jobs, and what did you have in your mind that you think was unique, that we understand better in Asia?
Well, I think what Steve Jobs said was really just a statement of fact about how the world of manufacturing has globalized over the last 30 years. In fact, the real globalization happened with the advent of China, with Deng Xiaoping opening up China in 1979. All in one go, the world increased its labor force by basically, some say 20%, some say 25%. And I think it's inevitable that manufacturing jobs in a globalized world, where transportation costs have been lowered dramatically in the last decades, where barriers to trade have been lowered through the efforts of WTO, really for the betterment of all the economies around the world, that something like that you cannot turn the clock back. Now, a better way perhaps of looking at flow in not only trade in goods but also trade in services is to look at it perhaps in what are tradable goods and what are non-tradable goods and services. Okay, tradable goods and services will be something that will be inevitably be globalized, because by definition they are tradable. Now, services come in only in recent years. You would know, for example, the most famous example is the IT out of Bangalore. People would have not thought that was a tradable service even 2 decades ago. It is now very tradable. Okay, but there are also non-tradable goods and services which has to stay, in the economy. And I think it's better for President Obama to look at, the world realistically and say that I have to encourage the growth of non-tradable goods and services, rather than stop the progress of the tradable goods and services around the world.
But the formula that seems to be coming in shape is that hard goods and services are focused on China, soft skills in other economies like India, and there is still a role for the U.S. In perhaps high value add services. With the desire to bring manufacturing back into the U.S., what do you think President Obama should be doing?
Well, you see, I think when you talk about manufacturing, there are many stages of manufacturing. The final assembly, a lot of times of consumer goods in particular, usually are labor intensive, and they tend to gravitate towards labor intensive countries like China and India. Okay, but there are also parts of it where it's very knowledge intensive and very subject to innovation.
You think that will not change? You think that will remain in
to the extent that America, Western society like America, and for example in design, in fashion, in Europe, they seem to be keeping the edge very well. If you look around you, all the luxury labels are French or Italian. If you look at the Zaras of this world, they still dominate. Okay, so it's a matter of finding what your comparative advantage is in this new world.
Given the history of Li & Fung and how you evolved and the growth years for Li & Fung has been in the opening up of China, as you mentioned, in the value-added aspect of the tradable goods, and today you talk more in terms of networks because you represent such a great variety of supply and demand or in the networks that you serve. Given that history, where is the world today in winners and losers in the production process?
Well, first of all, the winners and losers keep changing. It's a movable feast. If you look at the latest news out of China, especially in the last year or two, people are talking about rising costs in China. In fact, it's a conscious government effort in China to raise the standard of living of their people. And they're talking about, in this latest 12th five-year plan, they're talking about a 13% plus increase in minimum wage across China in the next 5 years. That means wages in China will almost double to 83%.
Now, I want to add also to that the component of the fact that China is also becoming a consumption nation.
That's right. Well,
right?
That's the follow-on.
Now, how are you seeing the trend in your own business as these complexities are added on?
Well, what it means is that in the old days, or the old days meaning 20, 30 years ago, it seems like a very unidirectional trade. You manufacture in the developing countries where labor is relatively plentiful and better value, and you ship to the consuming countries of the world, which are primarily the developed markets, especially for these consumer goods that's labor intensive. But now that equation is changing. A country like China will now have the domestic market, and they want the domestic consumption to go up and consume world-class goods. So they will now be a market that we can sell to as well. So the new equation is that we actually try to manufacture wherever in the world it's advantageous to do so. And it could be the developed country for certain technology products, and sell everywhere in the world, including the underdeveloped countries.
So as an organization, are you a Hong Kong-centric organization, or do you have multiple nodes, as it were?
It's basically multiple nodes. Yeah, Hong Kong is our headquarters, but very much so, we work in over 40 economies around the world, and they're now becoming both our markets as well as our places we sell to, as well as
Describe to me the knowledge flow in your network. Where does it originate, and where is the value add built? Of course, you're a privately owned company in Hong Kong, and basically your profits are booked in Hong Kong in a sense. But how do you manage this multiplicity of origination points in the knowledge part of your business?
Well, that is something that we built up, frankly, over a very long time. The idea is that our basic assumption is that the world is flat, which means that you go to the best place in the world to manufacture any product. That's how you get world quality and world-class products. Okay, once you have that in mind, then you actually go wherever in the world you should be going. And don't forget, it's not all black or white. Sometimes, it's better for us to manufacture everything in China. Sometimes it's better for us manufacturing in Europe. It requires a very quick response to catch a fashion trend and so on. And sometimes it's a combination of both.
Give you a small shot rising sun or a shooting star in the sky at the moment, the rise of Myanmar. How's that going to influence your business?
Well, Myanmar is coming to the party, as many developing countries have done so in the past, including Vietnam, Cambodia. There's some countries have been there, gone away, and come back, like Indonesia. And
so do you find that you have to build your knowledge base of what's possible?
Constantly updating it.
So what's Myanmar potentially good for in the trade equation?
Well, okay, Myanmar definitely follows the model of a country where labor is plentiful. They want to move from the agricultural sector, industrial sector, and labor-intensive types of manufacturing is definitely what it should be doing, if you look at the history of other neighboring countries. However, Myanmar had the problem of a political stigma, and they're now addressing that, or seem to be addressing it. We have customers who would not buy from Myanmar because of the political stigma, even though they may be cheaper. So it's not just all on price.
But what's interesting is that even as these lowest cost producers enter the marketplace, the rules are changing in that they can't, go on to take on the labor-intensive child labor, environmentally polluting industry. So the entry level is going to be higher for Myanmar than it would have been for Vietnam.
First of all, the development in our business in the last few years have been very much a respect for human rights, basic human rights and labor conditions, a basic respect for the environment. And actually, you cannot have anybody buying from places that do not conform. Because in the end, if you look at the marketing companies, their greatest equity is in their brand. And they cannot afford to have their brand associated with any of the, what would be considered malpractice in the market. And we're very much part of that whole process. And we ensure that even though it may be the cheapest, Okay, you just cannot go there because of problems like child labor and other things. And I think most countries now in the world involved in this trade, understands that. And there's a minimum level where they have to conform. And after that, then you compete on availability of labor.
I asked you about the role of knowledge in the networks that you build, the role of capital. Where does it originate? How do you manage the flow of capital in a trade network that you provide?
Okay, now I think knowledge is actually more important. Capital has become globalized. I think you will see that unless the new bank reforms that we're going to see, we haven't really seen yet, is going to restrict it more geographically. Right now, capital flows everywhere in the world, and the market is fairly open, except for some countries where there's capital controls and so on.
Now, in terms of putting their own stake in the global trade marketplace, countries have sort of given up on multilateral trade agreements, the GATT round and so on. And there's so many bilateral agreements coming together in the world. What are the pros and cons of taking a bilateral approach? It seems to be working, it seems to be moving faster than any attempt at a multilateral approach.
Well, first of all, a multilateral system is always harder to put in because it requires the acquiescence of all parties. However, that's certainly the more desirable one. The idea of most favored nation, everybody treated the same. The bilateral certainly makes trade more complex, and it diverts trade to places probably where it should not normally have been if there were no artificially high barriers to other countries.
Do you see examples of that?
Oh, it is everywhere. You look at if you look at the EU itself. Within EU is free trade coming in. Of course, there's duty and other things. If you look at NAFTA, and now you're talking about the newer bilaterals and the free trade areas. All of these are attempts to move eventually towards a multilateral system. And I think it's the frustration of putting together a workable multilateral system, a la the Doha round, that has prompted governments to say that, well, if I can't do it multilateral, let me at least do it with my own allies, or where our interests coincide, like the ASEAN.
I wish I was able to speak to you on issues like the rise of regional trade within Asia and what the implications there are. The rise of Indonesia, for example. Did you see that coming across in your business? But we don't have time. But I hope that we'll be able to continue this conversation going forward. Thank you very much.